answer questions as I go. So if you do happen to have a question that goes in the Q&A, I may try to answer it. I'm just going to keep rolling on though. So like Laurel said, my name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest specialist with the Department of Entomology at Purdue University. I also work under the supervision of Dr. Matt Ginzel there for the Hardwood Timber Improvement and Regeneration Center. I used to work with Dr. Cliff Sadoff, who a lot of you are probably familiar with. He's gone on now to his very well-deserved retirement. A lot of the reasons I mention them is because all of these folks have worked heavily with emerald ash borer in the past, and my own background comes quite a bit from the introduction of this insect some time ago now. So I'm going to approach this a little bit from an extension point of view. So I was a field extension educator for Purdue University for several years, and a lot of what I did was I helped people answer questions specifically on entomology, and I specialize in invasive species. So I did a lot of focus on emerald ash borer in Indiana. Some of you are just now beginning to deal with what emerald ash borer is going to mean for your state. Those of you in Oregon, I've seen that there are some issues in Texas. So you are getting some initial introductions as to what this insect may mean for you, whereas a lot of us, we've dealt with it for several years now, and we're trying to make sure people can benefit from that experience because you don't want this bug. It's terrible. But I do want to go through this as though I were addressing folks who may not be as familiar with it, and I'm going to try to give you an idea of how you can approach answering those questions too if you're working with clients or a public-facing organization and you need to address those questions. So first off, just a little bit of history. Most of us are going to be familiar with this. EAB, or emerald ash borer, is native to different portions of Asia, including Russia, northern China, Japan, and Korea. And it wasn't seen in North America prior to 2002, though I think that number could probably be argued a little bit depending on who you talk to. We do believe that it arrived in North America in solid wood packing materials. Now, this was kind of interesting in my own professional background because one of the first jobs that I ever had after being a student at Purdue was I worked with a pest control management firm who were working with companies that were doing shipping of materials from overseas. And I got to see some of the big log fumigations of materials that were coming from Asia. And that was really, really something to see. And it kind of formed a lot of my experience going into working with invasive species. And of course, back then, the only invasive species people really cared about was emerald ash borer. So just some context as to I'm going to use my experience in Indiana to hold this conversation, and I want you to understand the context that I'm coming from. So emerald ash borer first got here in Indiana in 2004, and then I was an undergrad at Purdue, and I had the opportunity to work for Dr. Jeff Holland in his landscape ecology lab, and he was studying the spread of invasive species, trying to create different models, looking at their spread, and emerald ash borer, of course, was the big one. Now, blessedly or unfortunately, emerald ash borer is a specialist species, as we all know. It will only attack ash trees. This means in Indiana, we have a lot of dead ash. One of the most common questions that I get, whether I was an extension educator or in my role now, is all the ash trees are dead? Why do we care? People don't seem to realize yet that there are still ash populations, and there is still some relevance, to protecting those populations. How you approach that and how you determine that is really going to be a challenge for a lot of people to understand. So when I teach different groups of people about different invasive species, I always start with life cycle, whether you have been working with them for 30 years or whether you only just got introduced to them. The reason for this is it helps us create a little bit of common ground for what we're going to understand, and it gives me an opportunity to learn some more because often those professionals that I'm talking to will say, hey, you didn't mention this, and I will probably realize that there's a bit that I didn't know and I want to add in. So first off, some basics. Emerald ash borer is generally an annual species, but if the conditions are right, they can live for 1 or 2 seasons in a really healthy host. I think in Indiana, we typically see them just live a single season. The adults are feed eating, the adults are leaf eating, while the larva will consume the nutrient carrying tissue, the phloem tissue that is just underneath the bark of the tree. One of the things that people also typically do not realize is that they will only spread so far on their own. Some of the more recent things I've read have stated about half a mile a year. Keep in mind, these are flighted insects. They just don't seem to want to fly that far. But we assist them in their movement, which is why I really wanted to work with the Nature Conservancy and the Don't Move the Firewood program, because that's the name of the game. Us moving firewood and other wood materials has helped their spread, and it really, really helped their spread in the state of Indiana. Now, just to give you an idea of their life cycle, I also want to preface this by saying that all the pictures and all the images here, these are not mine. These were taken from individuals like John Obermeyer, a great photographer in Purdue's entomology department, Cliff Sadoff, several of those you may recognize, as well as other sources. And I should hopefully get all of them marked soon, though I'm still going through and catching them all. Now, the usual life cycle that we're familiar with, larvae are going to chew galleries through the phloem tissue of the tree. Now, the thing to keep in mind here too, if you're helping a client or someone else try to identify that, is that those galleries are right underneath the bark. You can easily scrape it away the bark and see it, and those galleries tend to be S-shaped. You will find other wood-boring insects in a lot of trees, including ash trees. Emerald ash borer has these really unique S-shaped galleries that you can kind of see in this image. They're going to overwinter and pupate in those galleries. Pupation will take place during the spring, and then adults are going to emerge from D-shaped holes. Now, those holes, they're shaped like a D because the adult has that kind of shape if you look at it forward. And also, one thing that I often have to clarify with folks is that the adults do not bore into the wood. That D shape comes from new adults emerging from the wood tissue. They can be present May through September, but only for 2 weeks or so at most. Now, let's focus on our life stages a little bit so that way we know how to identify each stage as we go, and we can understand which stages are going to be important. So we just saw the adults. I'm going to go back to that image real fast here. So the adults, they're really unique to me, and one of the earliest insects that I got the joy of learning how to pin. The adults are very, very small, and they are very, very hard. I remember catching thousands of these, and we were trying to pin them to have volunteer specimens, and you practically need a ball-peen hammer to drive a pin through that insect's body. They are very, very tough. These adults will go ahead and lay their eggs in the crevices of wood, just like you can see this adult emerald ash borer doing right now. It's got its ovipositor stuck into a crevice on an ash tree, and the eggs are being laid in that crevice. The adults are also this great iridescent color. I have actually seen people create jewelry using them. And they are about the size of a cooked grain of rice, so people will put them together and create all kinds of things, though whenever I see this, I kind of internally scream a little bit. Now, one of the invasives that we often talk about right now, or several of them, can be something like spotted lanternfly, who have piercing sucking mouth parts. So I like to make sure that people understand that these do not. Emerald ash borer all have chewing mouth parts. Their larvae chew through wood. The adults chew through leaves and shred them. And unlike things like spongy moth, another important invasive, there is no sexual dimorphism amongst male and female emerald ash borer. They will all look the same. So it makes it a little tough if you're trying to do something like use a difference in sex to try to control them. Now, the larval stages, I think, are kind of fascinating in their appearance. And when I was learning entomology, one of the big things you always learned, and you learn this a lot with biology in general, is that form equals function. And that's very, very true about these larvae. You can see they have very, very large areas right behind the hardened parts of their head. These are where undoubtedly there's just tons of muscle packed in there so they can chew through the wood tissue that they're trying to get through. And they have bodies where you can see their shape is intended to crawl forward through something and probably to help them push through the galleries that they're chewing through. Now, the larvae generally are going to be pale or beige in color, and they're not really going to reach much more than 1.25 inches long once the larvae reach their final instar. I have to apologize, I don't recall how many instars the insects have off the top of my head. They're going to live entirely in that cambium tissue that they are chewing through. So they live in their food substrate, and that is where they'll create their galleries, and they will not leave that until they are ready to emerge. What's really interesting, if you're ever teaching this, is if you have a sample of wood from an ash tree that has a gallery in it, you can actually look and see how the gallery will expand over time and widthwise as the insect grows larger and larger. Eventually, they will dig out a pupation chamber in that cambrium and pupate and develop into an adult. Now, for those of you who are in states that are experiencing Asian longhorn beetle, there is a difference here. So Asian longhorn beetle will dig straight into wood, and they'll chew and consume that wood and create a pupation chamber deep in the wood. Emerald ash borer will only stay in the cambrium tissue. They will not go beyond that. So that's a very important difference to keep in mind. Now, I do see a question pop up. Someone's asking, there's a paper in 2015 about emerald ash borer attacking olive trees, and they had 40% of the numbers found on ash. Is that true? I don't know, actually. I have not seen that paper. Conventional knowledge that I have is just that emerald ash borer specializes in ash. So after we're done talking here, I may go look that up to see, because I'm very curious. Now, as for the pupa and the eggs, there's not really much that we can say here. Most likely, people won't see them. Pupa are, like I said, are pretty deep into the wood. They're going to be still. First, well, I shouldn't get ahead of myself here. So let's start with the eggs that I have here. Now, those eggs, like I showed you the picture of the adult earlier, they're laid into bark crevices. The adult is not boring into the wood. They are laying the eggs in a crevice. That's important when you're talking to the public, because they may not understand that. The eggs are going to hatch in 7 to 10 days, so these are very tiny eggs, and they hatch very, very quickly. And insects, their entire life cycle and their success is going to be based on the temperature outside. The warmer it is, the faster they'll develop. If it's too warm, they'll end up estivating. But if the conditions are right, they can develop very, very quickly. And like I said, the eggs are very small. They're only going to be about a millimeter in diameter. I myself, I have not actually found eggs in the wild. I've never actually dug into a tree to locate the eggs myself. I've only been able to use pictures to look at them. Generally, you're going to be a specialist if you're really trying to find eggs in that. Now, the pupa, where I was getting ahead of myself, like I was saying there, larvae are going to dig out these pupal chambers to metamorphose. This is going to keep them safe from predators. It's also going to make it so that nothing's going to dig in very easily to find them. Woodpeckers and sapsuckers will try to get them, and some of them can go ahead and find those, but you're really not going to find too many other things that are really going to find those insects to consume them. The pupa is non-moving and it doesn't feed. So this is the stage of the insect's life where it becomes dormant and its body literally breaks down and gets put back together again. The pupa is also what we entomologists refer to as exarate. They are exposed, and you can visibly see the changes in their body on the outside of the pupa. And when the pupa reaches its final stages, it will look like a plastic mold of the adult itself, until eventually they will go ahead and break out of that pupal skin and the adult will go ahead and emerge. And that's going to happen after about 1 to 2 weeks based on the temperature. So if I were using Indiana as an example right now with our current weather conditions, we had an extremely mild winter here, and our spring has been very, very pleasant. And now the last several days, it's been very warm. We're experiencing temperatures that would be more like July. So we can see that development time get cut quite a bit. And of course, what's this going to do? What is this actually going to do to our ash trees? Because people will just look at this and say, well, all the ash are dead. Well, how did the ash die? What is it actually going to do? Because it's going to be important as we try to determine, can I save my ash trees, or should I save my ash trees, as I had on that title screen? So what's going to happen here is you have larvae that are just tunneling straight through the circulatory system of the tree. So imagine if that happened to you. You aren't going to survive that experience, and neither does the ash tree. It may take time. Sometimes you can have ash trees that will live 6 to 10 years after infestation begins, but the ash tree will die unless that damage is mitigated somehow. Now, that vascular system is going to be very severely impacted, which means that one of the biggest signs we will see of damage is going to be a loss of canopy. And I am outlining that right there because that's going to be important as we begin to analyze whether a tree is going to be rescuable or not. Eventually, the damage due to emerald ash borer is going to render the tree brittle. And this isn't just as simply, it's not going to be in as good a condition before. These trees will come down. In Indiana, one of the counties that I worked in as an extension educator, we actually had people's property become damaged because they didn't remove dead ash trees from it, and it resulted in damage to homes or vehicles. So it's important that people get a jump on this when it starts to happen to them. The earlier, the better. So this is just a picture here that kind of illustrates what that damage is going to look like. So all the way on the left, you can see a strip of bark that's been removed, and it's exposed the damage underneath on the wood. And you can actually see the emerald ash borer sitting right there. That's probably a newly emerged adult. And then the picture in the middle, that I believe is where Dr. Sadoff actually used a hatchet to go away and scrape bark to demonstrate the gallery that was forming. But that last picture all the way on the right, I think that one is just fascinating. That is a tree that has been infested so badly for so long. You can't see the wood for the galleries underneath it. This tree absolutely must come down. This tree is so dead, and it is very, very brittle. I feel like the person who took that picture is actually brave for just standing that close to it, because a good windstorm will knock it right over. So this kind of leads into this idea of we now need to make our treatment decisions. I often, especially when I'm teaching things like this to, say, master gardeners or similar groups, I will talk to them about making decisions in an IPM program. And this kind of feeds into that concept too. We need to determine, what do we want out of these trees, and is it going to be worth the effort? Because can you save an ash tree? The short answer is yes, you absolutely can. But the real question is, should I, and do I have enough time to do it? That's the question that you or your clients may be trying to address. So first off, we need to ask, do you want to save them in the first place? There are a lot of folks who will just look at this and say, well, there's emerald ash borer, my trees are losing some leaves, I'm just going to go ahead and take them down no matter what. And some folks who just can't change their mind on it, or they may not be able to afford doing anything different. And then, of course, are they worth saving? This kind of leads back into that idea of, how long has the tree been infested? How much damage has it taken? How much of its canopy is remaining? How many dead limbs, etc.? What are the size of the trees? Tree size are going to play an important role, because it's going to determine whether or not a homeowner can actually do this job, or if they need to hire someone to do it. And then one of the ones that's really important that I'm going to show you a little bit more on here shortly is, what's the condition of the canopy? A lot of you have probably seen some of the papers on it before, but the percentage of canopy remaining is going to be a big determiner of whether the tree is rescuable or not. Now, the first steps that I often talk to folks about that you can do on your own is, first, you can measure the DBH of the tree, the diameter at breast height. You can estimate the percentage of remaining canopy, and then check the limbs on the trees, whether they're dead or alive. Because remember, if an ash tree that's infested has a dead limb, that limb's not going to regenerate its leaf tissue. Its circulatory system's been cut. There's no vascular system connecting it. So it is dead, and it's going to come down. Now, there's a nice kind of question, yes or no answer tree that Dr. Sadoff and some partners developed several years back that I think is still very, very relevant. And I can always link that to folks or share it with the Nature Conservancy later to send to you. But what you can do next, or what you can counsel your clients to do next, is, if they aren't sure about what they need to do to save their ash, but they still want to, or if they're working with a tree that has a diameter at breast height that's greater than 20 inches, they really should get professional help, because the steps involved here require specialized knowledge, and you need someone who can evaluate the trees accurately. Now, if the homeowner is confident, there are some products they can use, and there's a few different steps that they can take to figure out how to use those products. Oftentimes, it involves using an insecticide as a soil drench. However, something that everyone does need to understand, there is no way to manage EAB without the use of an insecticide. It can't happen. Now, the good news about that is that even though most of those insecticides, or all of them, are essentially systemic insecticides, ash trees aren't really super populated with pollinators. They are wind-pollinated trees, so the impact, so long as used properly, should minimize the damage to pollinator populations. And I think I go over that a little bit more later. So I was just talking about Canopy, right? This is a great picture that kind of illustrates that. So this is an image from Indianapolis. This was taken by Dr. Cliff Sadoff when he was conducting a study to see what kind of treatment schedule is going to work best to rescue ash trees. And he based this on how thinned out was the canopy. So first off, let's take a look at our canopies of these trees, starting with the tree that's lost about 10%. This tree is still in pretty good condition. Its limb loss is very minimal, and it still has most of its canopy. So this tree is very, very rescuable. With treatment, you should be able to keep this tree for a long time. However, when you begin to lose more than 10%, now questions start to pop up because as you could see from the tree you're looking at right here, there are a few more dead limbs now. There's a lot less of the canopy. Rescuing it is going to be harder, but it is still possible. And then finally, once you get past 30%, there is essentially no rescue strategy you can use. Those limbs that are bare, they're dead. They're not going to come back, and that tree almost certainly won't survive. So just summing that up a little bit, when trees have greater than 70% of their canopy, they're very rescuable. And hopefully people will take those steps to go ahead and keep them safe. They just need a treatment schedule. However, when you get to that 30% canopy loss, those trees become compromised. Not only are they losing limbs, but the tree itself is now becoming dangerous. It could actually come down during hard windstorms. And folks, I don't know how your states have been doing, but if you watch the weather lately, there are all kinds of weather events like tornadoes and derechos that have been going through the Midwest and the Central Plains, and those are the ideal conditions to bring down a brittle ash tree. And if climate change is any indicator, that's probably going to become a norm. Now, as for some of the chemicals involved with this, there are a few different ones. I've highlighted imidacloprid there in green because imidacloprid is probably the only one that's going to be available where a homeowner could go ahead and apply it. It does not have a restricted use label on the products that are available for purchase, and it should be easily applied in the form of, say, a soil drench. So long as people are following the label directions and following a good schedule with it, they should be able to keep their ash trees alive. Other chemicals, however, basically all of them underneath that, you really, really should get a professional to help because most likely they're going to involve an injection. Dinotefuran definitely has some injection strategies. Imamectin benzoate, which is probably the most effective chemical we can use to combat them, really does use tree injections. That's about it as far as I'm aware. Azadirachtin isn't actually something that's going to so much be toxic, but it will reduce the fecundity of the adults. So their ability to reproduce will be compromised if they're being treated with that to hopefully reduce future populations. So I kind of point out here that not all these applications are made in the same way, which is why it's so important that a client be able to answer that question if they're comfortable doing this themselves or not. So you can see here where I've got imidacloprid, you can apply it as a soil drench or with a granular spread. Dinotefuran, again, soil drench or bark spray, but I would really encourage people if you're going to use dinotefuran or any chemical below that to go ahead and get professional help. Imamectin benzoate and azadirachtin are both done via injection. Like you can see there on the slide, I really do encourage professional help is required for most of these. Don't attempt them on your own. I am kind of the opinion I would prefer people just get professional help anyways, because ash trees do run into some nasty problems with emerald ash borer infestation. And I would rather not have anybody taking risks if they don't understand if a tree is compromised structurally or not. So generally, I just encourage folks, get a professional, or if you live in a state that has a really active extension service, like Purdue Extension, see if you can get a local extension agent or extension educator to come out and visit a property, because if they themselves don't have that expertise, they know someone who does, and they can help you get it. Now, I kind of addressed this a little bit ago, so something a little bit about its non-target lethality. A lot of folks are very uncomfortable with systemic insecticides, and for good reason. Oftentimes, systemics can have really nasty interactions with pollinators and non-target insects and other organisms. And one of our biggest goals is to make sure that if we do use pesticides, we want to do so responsibly to our environment and to ourselves. Now, the good thing is that ash, they're wind pollinated. Not many pollinators going to be hanging out around ash in that sense. We do want to make sure that we avoid planting pollinator-friendly plants near ash that is being treated. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if you have like a nice set of ornamentals that you have underneath the tree. We also want to make sure that we avoid groundwater contamination, which is why it's so important to follow labels when you're using those products. Because if you're doing a soil drench and you overdo it, you could potentially get that to leach into the groundwater, depending on the adsorption of the chemicals that you're using or the application method. All right, so now just some common questions that we often address with this. These are ones that I work with people and try to answer. In some summers, I feel like that's all I'm doing. But I like to put these in because whether you're a professional or not, it can really help you figure out how to begin to navigate some of those more difficult conversations. For example, here in Indiana, we just completed, or our DNR just completed, several of their treatments for spongy moth in the northern portion of the state using mating disruption and applications of BTK. The public often doesn't understand what's going on when we use these. So we need to make sure that if those tough questions come up, we can answer them and help people understand that, no, this isn't going to be dangerous to you or your family. We're being very careful with it. One of the biggest questions I get, we don't have any more ash, so why are we bothering? Well, that's not necessarily true. Ash is replacing itself. Emerald ash borer doesn't attack saplings or younger trees. They want the bigger ones. So we're seeing where the seed bank is able to get some level of replacement, or at least the seed bank that exists is getting replaced out of the soil and just growing out of the soil. So we see ash come up year after year. Here in Indiana, we're having to acknowledge that emerald ash borer is now a permanent part of our ecosystem because we have just enough ash coming up, and then once they get big enough, the emerald ash borer comes, and that cycle just keeps repeating itself. And it can take a tree 6 to 10 years before enough damage happens to kill it, which means that tree can feasibly survive long enough to create seeds and then keep replacing itself as time goes on. Now, of course, the big question that this talk kind of brings forward is it worth it to continue treating my trees? I talked a lot about pesticide application, but the question is, can you afford it? Is this something that's feasible? Well, do you remember that research study I was talking about that Dr. Sadoff did in Indianapolis? What he did is he wanted to compare the cost of removal versus the cost of treatment when it came to ash trees. So what he found that removal costs could range, a few years ago when he did this study, mind you, between $1,800 to $3,600, which is a big chunk of change to remove a dead ash tree. Whereas treatment cost, he found that if you treated trees once every 3 years to the tune of roughly $300, if you consider that it's about $10 a diameter for treatment, you could keep the ash tree alive. And of course, he was associating that with the risk of having brittle trees that you don't want to have come down and potential property damage. So the result of his study found that what they did is that they treated trees with imamectin benzoate, and they applied this in 2013 and 2016, and they found that the trees were safe. After 2016, they stopped. The protection those trees had remained stable until 2019, when all of a sudden you began to see infestations grow and the damage to trees became visible. And then after 3 years in 2022, the trees were damaged enough that they had to be removed because they had become a safety hazard, essentially establishing that, yes, treating once every 3 years is going to keep your tree safe, and it's probably going to be more financially feasible for you to do that as versus removing a tree or, heaven help you, having a tree damage your property in some way or damage you. So some good practices for prevention that I like to talk to folks about, and this especially feeds into what the Nature Conservancy is trying to express this week, is that don't move firewood, please. So when I was a college undergrad, EAB first got to Indiana, and we had a bunch of bumper stickers that said, "Don't move the firewood, it bugs me." This is just as true today. Emerald ash borer can still spread, and there are other insects that can sit on firewood and be spread by them. Spongy moth, spotted lanternfly, and a few others who can be transported in that way. So please don't move firewood around. States in where Indiana is and further east, EAB is probably a permanent part of your ecosystem, but this doesn't mean that you can't protect your trees. Now, the last point I have there too is that the quarantine on EAB in Indiana was lifted in 2016, but we still encourage folks that if you're going to use firewood, please burn it where you find it or where you buy it. Don't move firewood, just burn it where it is if you're going to do so. That way you will help limit the continuing spread of all kinds of invasives and hopefully limit populations of emerald ash borer. I would like to encourage folks to consider scheduling treatment for your trees. I've actually had several conversations this week alone where people have asked me about damage to their ash trees and what they can do, and found that a lot of them were doing treatment schedules once a year or once every 2 years to the tune of $1,000. And they didn't realize that this isn't necessarily something that needs to happen. Infestation is going to be inevitable, but with treatment, we could still reduce those populations and we can still make sure that our trees will survive. Hopefully, eventually, resistant ash trees will appear. But until then, I think we can keep things alive and we can protect ash in different states. All right, with that, that is what I wanted to talk to all of you about. Thank you for listening. I know we've got a couple of questions here in the Q&A. I'll try to see what I've got. All right, thank you for sharing that citation. I will look at that when I can. And it looks like you do write your own extension homeowner guides on to add products. All right. So do we have any other questions as well?
Thank you, Bob. That was amazing. Yes, if anybody has questions, we have ample time for that now. If you want to pop it into the question and answer feature, it looks like even if you want to do it in the chat, we'll be able to see that pretty clearly. I have a question, Bob. Something that I've noticed in just anecdotally in a lot of our social media and posts and such, especially stuff that's targeted for the Midwest and other areas that have had emerald ash borer for a long time, is kind of this sentiment that's like almost giving up, like, oh, it's everywhere, all the ash are done for, just move the firewood around, it doesn't matter. Do you come across that a lot in the folks you talk to, and what is your strategy for dealing with that sentiment?
So in this day and age, it seems a really common thing to run into people who are just kind of exhausted of kind of all the things. We keep getting hit with it a little bit, and invasive species are definitely a big part of that. I run into this quite a bit because people are just flooded with the information on it. And I try to encourage them because even though invasive species are kind of going to be a permanent thing in our lives, we can still protect a lot of the plants that we love. And often that protection may not come at a very large cost. And what I often will do too is people have this kind of morbid fascination about insects. So helping them learn more about the insect itself really will tune people into what are they doing and, well, what can I do to help this and what could I do to stop it now? Part of it is I'm just an entomologist who loves talking about bugs and I like getting people excited about it. And that's kind of how I approach that. You see, I see a few more questions popping in. So I have a homeowner, I have saplings that are about 20 inches. Should I try to keep all but a few? That honestly depends on how much you want to invest in it. Like I said, we found that once every 3 years to roughly $300, but that is an estimation, and that may vary by state and what businesses are available to you. The biggest thing I would encourage you to do is to consider getting an arborist out to your property to have a conversation and determine what's going to be the best action for you. And then I see someone asking, is imidacloprid labeled for EAB treatment? Yes, there should be imidacloprid products that are labeled for EAB treatment. The big thing is the way it's applied and the formulation it comes in. You're going to want to get a product that is labeled for EAB treatment, but it is labeled for that use because imidacloprid is used for a lot of different insects. Let's see. Someone in the Q&A is saying I did some work modeling the life cycle of EAB with degree day models. I missed degree day models. You touched on how temperature affects their development, especially in the one-year life cycle. Do you think that in northern regions, EAB invasive range become highly susceptible in the next 5 to 10 years? Do you mean susceptible to extreme temperatures, or do you think like they'll experience more than be able to survive for more than 1 year? That one I could only speculate on, and I am definitely not an expert in that area. Is it possible that they could begin living longer? I think so, depending on the quality of hosts they find, though. I see another question. What is the effect of azadirachtin on tree health over time? Now, I am not sure on that one because azadirachtin is not a chemical that I have often used myself. If it affects the growth of an insect and its fecundity, it should have minimal effect on tree health, but I would like to check a label and read up a little bit on azadirachtin before I give you a firm answer to that one. Does utilization of a tree growth regulator soil drench in conjunction with imamectin benzoate trunk injection potentially extend the length of the 3-year protection? Danny, I don't know if I could answer that one. I would hesitate to even try to answer that one because those two formulations could have an interaction that I just don't know. So I would definitely want to check labels on that to see. And then Jacob, as in, does reducing the fecundity of EAB affect the survival of ash being treated? It should, yes, because reducing their fecundity is going to essentially reduce their future numbers. So these insects, they're going to keep hitting the same trees that they're using as hosts because they know those hosts work. And they're going to keep using them until they can't anymore. So yes, it's for an individual tree, it's not going to be, say, as great as if you're using imamectin benzoate to directly kill them, but you're kind of looking at this through the long-term lens of I'm slowly reducing that population until eventually the population will probably crash out or move on.
Looks like you have another question in the Q&A from Mark. How far out from the center of the tree do you do a soil drench with pesticides?
So there actually is some writing on that. I don't remember what the actual number is, but you can actually look up some papers. I think Dr. Sadoff actually did publish some information on that one. The soil drench, the pesticide for the soil drench should also have on the label that distance as well. So I can try to share that with Laurel to make sure it gets to you because there is an answer to that one. I just don't recall it off the top of my head. And then let's see, I see, won't EAB attack trees that are between 1 and 4 inches? Generally, no, they want the older trees because if their young are going for that cambium underneath the bark, they like that cambium to be nice and thick so their young have enough to eat. If the tree is too small, they're not going to bother. Most recommendations for treatment don't even start until the DBH is at about 15 inches, I believe. And then I see in the chat, yeah, so one of the funny things that people don't realize, responding to what Jacob is saying in the chat there, is that a lot of these insects, they are going to rely on the hosts that they have been using. It's a concept called habitat selection. Now, not all insects are going to do that as big as others. Spotted lanternfly is a big one in returning to hosts that have been successful before. But emerald ash borer, if a tree's been hit before, they're going to hit it again.
Great questions, folks. Any more? Oh, we have another one in the Q&A.
See, okay, it seems like a difficult thing to answer, but do you think that insecticides would affect developing parasitoids of EAB if they had been released in the area? That one would be me speculating, but I'm going to say that if there is a parasitoid that is attacking EAB that's feeding on a treated tree, then yes, the parasitoid should be affected because they're also getting exposed to the systemic insecticide inside their host body. But that is me doing a lot of speculation there. I'm not as up on the parasitoid work being done with EAB as I should be. But yes, I do think that it would have an impact. However, if you're doing biocontrol things too, you're probably not treating the tree because you're trying another option, unless you're doing some really interesting planning for that. And then someone's pointing out that, yeah, EAB keeps attacking the same ash in Texas. Yeah. All right, folks, I don't see any other questions. Thank you all. Those were great questions. I appreciate it. Oh, Laura, I think you're muted.
Man, every time.
It's okay. I do it too.
Yes, great questions. Is there anything else before we sign off? Right, seeing lots of thank yous. Well, that was a great talk. And as I mentioned, this is being recorded and we will have the recordings up by the end of the week with the links to our YouTube channel on our landing page, EAB Week 2024, off the don'tmovefirewood.org. So thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Bob Bruner, for a wonderful talk. And everybody take care. Hope to see you tomorrow for our last webinars.
Thanks,
Bye,
folks. You
everybody.
were great.